Hello. Today I'm going to talk to you about the qualifying child requirements on tax returns and the qualifying relative requirements for tax returns, how those affect various child-related tax benefits, such as the dependency exemption, head of household filing status, the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and then how the tax reform changes the child tax credit and the dependency exemption, what that will mean for tax requirements today and in the future.
Welcome to Tax Justice Warriors, the podcast that celebrates the work of low-income taxpayer clinics, focuses on tax controversy work, and looks at related issues in tax news. I'm your host, William Schmidt, the director of the Low-Income Taxpayer Clinic at Kansas Legal Services.
Hello. I'm going to talk to you about the qualifying child to begin with under Section 152C of the Internal Revenue Code. For each of these qualifying child tests, I'm going to talk to you to begin with about the dependency exemption. For each of the tests, I will go through head of household filing status, the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and the child independent care credit, what differences there might be. So all of these requirements will be for the year 2017 and before. And then I'm going to talk to you about the tax reform for 2018, what differences that makes for the dependency exemption and the child tax credit. So to begin with, the age test for a qualifying child, the child must be younger than the taxpayer and under age 19 or under age 24 and a full-time student, or the child can be any age and totally or permanently disabled. Now, this will be a qualifying child to allow a taxpayer to claim the child for the dependency exemption, head of household filing status, and the earned income tax credit. For the child tax credit, the child must be under age 17. That is an across-the-board requirement, so being a full-time student or disabled does not apply for the child tax credit. And then for the child independent care credit, the child must be under age 13 or disabled. Next, we have the relationship test. So the qualifying child must be the taxpayer's son, daughter, stepson, stepdaughter, eligible foster child, brother, sister, half-sibling, step-sibling, or a descendant of any of these individuals. For example, a descendant of a brother or sister would be a niece or nephew, so that person would qualify to be a qualifying child. Additionally, a person by adoption would then thus be a son or daughter, so an adoptive child would also qualify as a qualifying child. So then that requirement will allow a person to be a qualifying child for all of the 5 child-related tax benefits that I mentioned: the dependency exemption, head of household filing status, child tax credit, earned income tax credit, and child independent care credit. Next, there is the residency requirement. The child must have the same principal place of abode as the taxpayer for more than half the years, over 6 months. And again, that is for the 5 child-related tax benefit. Next, the child must not provide more than 1/2 of his or her own support. This is a requirement for all of the child-related tax benefits except the earned income tax credit, where there is no support requirement. By looking at the child support, what plays into it is this includes state or local or other welfare agencies or societies or foster care. That is part of the calculation and can be part of the child support of his or own self. So that certainly for all of these, you can look in publication 17 or publication 503 to determine if a child would qualify for one of the child-related tax benefits. Next, the child must be a U.S. citizen or a resident of Canada or Mexico. This will apply for the dependency exemption, head of household filing status, or child independent care credit. For the earned income tax credit, that is limited to a U.S. citizen or resident only with a valid social security number needed. The child tax credit is for a United States citizen or resident only, and for 2018, for sure a valid Social Security number is needed. Also, across the board, then the qualifying child may not file a joint return with the spouse other than for a claim for a refund. So those are the requirements for a qualifying child. Next, I'm going to talk to you about a qualifying relative. There is no age requirement for a qualifying relative. Now, the qualifying relative can be a child or a descendant of the child, a sibling or a son or daughter of the sibling, a father or mother, or ancestor or sibling of either, a step-sibling or step-parent, a son, daughter-in-law, father or mother-in-law, brother or sister-in-law. So really this expands the definition of the relative, so can include parents, siblings, cousins, nieces, nephews, a variety of relatives that would be included in there that do not fit in the qualifying child requirement, but also maybe an individual who does not have to be related but is a member of the taxpayer's household for the entire tax year. To some degree, the qualifying relative may not actually be a relative, but someone who is a member of the household for the entire tax year. For the residency requirement, there are really two branches for a qualifying relative. That the person who is related by blood or marriage, who is a relative for the relationship test, does not have to live with the taxpayer, but the unrelated individual must live with the taxpayer for the entire year. There is a gross income test for a qualifying relative, so the individual's gross income subject to tax must be less than the exemption amount for the entire year. Next, we have a support requirement that the taxpayer must provide more than one half of the individual's support, and multiple support agreements are allowed. Next, there is a citizenship test that the individual must be a United States citizen or a resident of Canada or Mexico. Generally the same test as for a qualifying child. Next, there is again a married dependent test for the qualifying relative. So again, the individual being claimed may not file a joint return with a spouse other than a claim for a refund, the same test as for a qualifying child. And then finally, the qualifying relative may not be a qualifying child. So the individual may not be a qualifying child of the taxpayer or of any other taxpayer. I went over the potential tax benefits for a qualifying child, the dependency exemption, the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, the child and dependent care credit, and the head of household filing status. Now for 2018, the dependency exemption will be going away. That will no longer be an allowed benefit for a qualifying child. For a qualifying relative, before 2018, there was the dependency exemption, the child and dependent care credit, and the head of household filing status. But after 2018, then there is no longer the dependency exemption, but there will be the non-refundable portion of the child tax credit. Going back to the child-related tax benefits, there are additional requirements for each of those different child-related tax benefits. For the dependency exemption, the child must not be claimed or allowed to be claimed as a dependent of another taxpayer. For head of household filing status, you must pay more than half the cost of maintaining a home for the individual that you are claiming. For the child tax credit, you must meet the earned income requirements for the refundable portion of the credit. For the earned income tax credit, then there are also earned income, investment income, various AGI limitations, Social Security number, U.S. residency, and other tests. And then for the child and dependent care credit, you must pay for child or dependent care so the taxpayer and the spouse can work. For 2018, there will no longer be a dependency exemption, but the qualifying relative will be allowed to claim the non-refundable portion of the child tax credit. What will be the child tax credit in 2018? that will now be a $2,000 potential credit for each qualifying child. Now, that $2,000 will be first applied as a non-refundable credit, so that reduces tax liability first. That can reduce it by $2,000. Now, if all of the liability is reduced, then there is up to $1,400 that can still be left on the credit available as a refundable portion. Also, there is the non-refundable portion of the child tax credit that will be allowed for a qualifying relative, so $500 may reduce tax liability for each qualifying relative. Next week, I would like to review the document requirements that would be required to claim each of these child-related tax benefits or qualifying relative tax benefits. If a person is audited, what documents are required in order to support your claim that you qualify for one of these benefits on your tax return. I hope this has been helpful for you, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to Tax Justice Warriors. We have a Patreon page if you'd like to support this podcast. Providing monetary support for this podcast helps with expenses like equipment or travel to tax conferences. Supporting this podcast through Patreon comes with rewards, so check out our Patreon page. Please rate or review this podcast because positive reviews help get more people to know this podcast exists. The views expressed on this podcast are not official opinions of the IRS, the Low Income Taxpayer Clinic program, or the employers of the people who spoke on this program. Your tax situation is unique, so do not take the statements on this program as tax or legal advice. Consult with your own tax professional to provide you with specific advice on your situation. Tune in next time on Tax Justice Warriors for another interesting tax discussion.